Well, good evening, everybody. It's so nice to see so many of you here. We had sold out the tickets. We had a wonderful wait list outside of people eager to come on. We're very pleased that we were able to accommodate you. So welcome to the Western Library for this evening's lecture, the first of three to be given in the coming days by Martin Puchner. Welcome too to what is the inaugural series in the new Torch, Princeton University Press lecture series in European History and Culture. My name is Philip Bullock and I'm Director of Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. I shall keep my introduction brief, but I do want to record some important thanks to key people and organisations. It's a great pleasure to acknowledge Princeton University Press for proposing this collaboration in the first place, and I'm grateful to Ben Tate of the Press and to Karen O'Brien, head of the Humanities Division, for the many productive conversations and coffees that we've had that have led to this evening's first lecture. Thanks to are due to the Bodleian Libraries, in particular to Richard Ovenden, Bodlei's librarian, and to all the Bodleian staff for hosting us here and helping with the practical arrangements. I'm personally indebted, as I am on every day of my working life, to all the staff at Torch for their help in organisational matters, and especially in this case to Ampara Gelidi and her predecessor as International Officer, Lydia Zanetti Dominguez. My colleague Julie Curtis, Professor of Russian Literature and Fellow of Wolfson College, helped very kindly to arrange accommodation for Martin's visit. I'm delighted now to be able to turn and introduce our lecturer this evening, and who will be lecturing for 2 further evenings this coming Friday and next Tuesday. If you haven't yet booked your tickets, please do. There are some available on Eventbrite. Martin Puchner is the Byron and Anita Wien Chair in Drama and in English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University, where he also serves as the founding director of the Mellon School of Theatre and Performance Research. His books include Stage Fright, Modernism, Anti-Theatricality and Drama, 2002, Poetry of the Revolution, Marx, Manifestos and the Avant-Garde, 2006, and The Drama of Ideas, Platonic Provocations in Theatre and Philosophy, 2010. He is responsible for many other books and collections, not least as general editor of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. After studies at Constance, Bologna and UC Santa Barbara, his career has taken him to Columbia and Harvard. It has, of course, also taken him around the world. He is much in demand as a public speaker, and his online courses have made a major contribution not only to debates around world literature, but about the value of the humanities more generally. His most recent book is a sweeping account of literature from the invention of writing to the internet, The Written World, The Power of Stories to Shape People, History, Civilization, 2017. It is an enthralling read, as I'm sure many of you in this room already know, not just because of the ambitious, imaginative journeys across time and space that its author takes us on, but also because of its intellectual generosity in sharing its debts to the community of scholars. When we were considering whom to invite for this inaugural lecture series, Martin's name came immediately and unbidden to our lips, and we were delighted that he accepted our invitation with alacrity. We are even more delighted when he gave his series the ambitious title not just of European culture and history, but World Literature for a Changing Planet, asking us to up our game here too. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Puchner to give the first of his lectures entitled The Challenge of World Literature. Afterwards, Martin has kindly agreed to take questions, and then we'll be able to spill harmoniously and naturally to a drinks reception in the foyer afterwards. Thank you for coming. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Philip, for this introduction. Can you all hear me? Does the microphone work? Wonderful. So thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation to give these lectures. I also want to thank Julie for hosting me at Wolfson College and Ben Tate for the Princeton University Press contribution. Ben just told me that I'm to be the guinea pig for this lecture series, so I suppose the outcome of the experiment will depend on how I behave in the next couple of days. So I'll do my best. So all 3 lectures are called World Literature for a Changing Planet. And I just want to say briefly why I came up with this title. And I want to start with the end. The Changing Planet, as you probably won't be surprised to hear, simply takes its point of departure from the fact that we live through a moment of climate change and climate crisis. And I've particularly noticed a dilemma when I talk to climate scientists, and not just climate scientists, that for the last 40 years or so, the belief has been more or less that the problem, the impediment to meaningful action was better science. So we've invested a lot in better climate science with the belief that if we get predictions from, let's say, 80% up to 95% certainty, that would make all the difference. We found that that's not the case. So I've had lots of conversations with climate scientists who have said that, who've turned to literary studies, asking us crucial information about how to turn scientific facts and discoveries into stories, because that is their finding, that in order to translate facts into meaningful action and broader frames of understanding, that they demand new stories, better ways of telling that story. And so they come to literary studies with questions about how stories emerge, how they get canonized, how they shape behavior. And the problem is, I think, that literary studies, as it is currently configured, is not in a very good place and shape to give answers to these stories, to these questions about how to turn scientific facts into stories. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One has to do with the fact that I think in the humanities in general, we don't really like to be made use of. We are shy away from making use of literature or literary studies. The word instrumentalize, I think, among our group of scholars is rarely used in a positive sense. Useful knowledge is not something we generally peddle. Another impediment, and one that I'll be addressing more fully in the second lecture, is also the way in which our discipline, especially literary study, conceive of our object of study, namely primarily along national literature and relatively small timescales. The average timescale of dissertations in our field and books in our field is about 50 to 70 years. And I think that avoiding these larger timescales is actually one of the impediments to asking some of these basic questions that climate scientists ask us about how stories function, how they circulate. So I'll be, especially on, I think it's Thursday, not Friday, the second lecture, whenever it is, I'll be making an argument about large timescales, and that we need to figure out in literary studies how to widen the scope, zoom out, in order to get a handle on some of these basic questions about literature and how it functions, both for, because these kinds of scales, I think, tell us different things about our object of study that are important to know, but also, and in particular, because they lend themselves better to working, for example, with climate scientists on this challenge and how to turn a climate science into stories. So this is the changing planet part of the title, the argument about instrumentalization or use of literature, useful knowledge. In a recent department meeting, I used the term applied literature, and that created shrieks of outrage from my colleagues. So I'm not sure I'll be more successful here on next week. The 4 implies this kind of instrumentalization or use that I would like literary studies to make of literature and to offer itself to this larger debate. And so why world literature? Because I think this term is one of the best ways of getting this larger, broader picture of literature, this larger time scale that I would like to offer into focus. So this is why I will be making today an argument in favor of world literature. Now, to be sure, this term is not without its problems and challenges. There's a lively debate about the term world literature, and I'll be referring to some of these debates today. But I'll be making an argument in favor of world literature, hoping to extract this term from its historical origin and to use it, including for the purposes I've just outlined. So this is the plan. Now, I want to start by trying to get a better handle on this term, world literature. And because when talking about world literature, and I'm making things worse by also including the planet here, the danger is always that you're talking about something extremely broad, extremely vague. And that challenge, that problem will certainly be haunting, I think, all three lectures. But in order to work against that a little bit, I want to zoom in on one particular moment, December 31st, 1827, a Wednesday in the small town of Weimar, because it is at that moment that the idea of world literature was born. Two actors were involved in this birth. The one, and they were very unlikely, one sitting with the back to us is Johann Eckermann, a lowly secretary to the great Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, recognized at the time as one of the great writers of and intellectuals of Europe. On that Wednesday, the following conversation took place between these two actors. Eckermann would come every couple of days over to Goethe's house and work with him. And on this Wednesday, he hadn't been to Goethe's house for a couple of days. So Goethe had a lot of pent-up observations and ideas that he wanted to hold forth. And he said, within the last few days, since I've last seen you, I've read many things, especially a Chinese novel, which occupies me still and seems to me very remarkable. A Chinese novel, says Eckermann, that must have been rather strange. So clearly Eckermann is surprised by this, but Goethe will have none of it. No, much less so than one thinks. So there's already here kind of tension. Eckermann is incredulous. Goethe insists on the fact that this Chinese novel is really important. This is much less strange than you think. The Chinese, especially since Goethe continues, the Chinese have thousands of them, of these novels, and they had them when our ancestors were still living in the trees. Now Eckermann is really astonished and can't really believe what is happening, that there are all these Chinese novels, that he's supposed to know something about it, that they had them when his Eckermann's ancestors were still living in the trees. Meanwhile, Goethe had started to talk about other things. He's speculating about holding forth on various writers' influence on his work. Samuel Richardson, he mentioned Samuel Richardson, but somehow Eckermann is still mulling over the fact that he had heard this thing about Chinese novels. And so he comes back to it all of a sudden. He says, isn't it strange, because Goethe had been talking about the nature of this Chinese novel, and so Eckermann says, isn't it strange that the works of this Chinese writer are so morally elevated, while those of the foremost poet of France, he's talking about Béranger, are not. And Goethe thinks that's a good idea. He says, yeah, that's true, but I think you're right. It just shows the kind of crazy topsy-turvy world we live in today. So kind of a moral register associated with this observation. But Eckermann is still not satisfied, and he still can't believe what's happening. And he keeps asking Goethe questions about this Chinese novel and why we should care about it. And it's at that moment that Goethe is clearly getting sort of irritated by this conversation, comes up with this truly astonishing sentence. Namely, he says, national literatures don't mean much anymore. The era of world literature is at hand, and everyone must contribute to accelerating it. It's a strange a sentence that on the one hand states a fact, makes a descriptive observation about the world, namely that we now live in the era of world literature, is at hand on that side. Goethe means it's timely, it's now, this is now the era of world literature. At the same time, it's not just descriptive, it's also in a sense normative, because we can't just hang back and let this era of world literature arrive. We, and this means you, Ackermann, who is not interested in world literature, is not interested in Chinese novels, who is hung up on the national poet of France, Béranger, you must contribute to it, you must accelerate it, you must help to bring it into being. So this is the birth, this is how the term world literature is born, out of this strange interaction and dialogue between Goethe and Ackermann. And Ackermann is clearly a kind of straw man here. In a way, Goethe is trying to provoke him. He's provoking him with this far-flung reading habit in Chinese novels, saying that there are thousands of them. Goethe had no way of knowing whether there were thousands of Chinese novels. He had read exactly 3. Those were the 3 translated into Western languages. But somehow I think he's trying to provoke him, because there's something so limited, narrow-minded about Ackermann at this moment. And so he reaches for the most outrageous term to provoke him, and that term is world literature. So this is how it is born. But how do we know about it? We know about it because of Ackermann, even though he's kind of the straw man in the story. And that story begins about 7-8 years earlier, when Ackermann had first contacted Goethe. Ackermann had grown up in abject poverty. The family income depended on a cow. He barely graduated from primary school. He had to work in his village. But he was always interested in literature and culture. He started to take Greek and Latin lessons from the village doctor. And then when he was way into his 20s, he managed finally to graduate from high school and even gain admission to university in Göttingen in law. So all was ready for a wonderful story of upward mobility. That's when he started to read Goethe. And it, in a sense, completely derailed his life. He started to write, he started to neglect his law studies. He started to write a dissertation about Goethe, and he sent that dissertation to Goethe. And then he started to walk. He lived hundreds of miles from Weimar. He couldn't afford a coach, so he started to walk to Weimar. And about 3 weeks later, he arrived, presented himself to Goethe, identified himself as the author of this dissertation on Goethe, and he offered his services as a secretary. And Goethe accepted. And so this is how this relationship began. Goethe paid Ackermann almost nothing for his services. But Ackermann was fine with that. He was thrilled to be in the presence of this great poet. He had to give up his engagement because he simply didn't have enough money to get married. But he gave it all up and he stayed with Goethe and started to work almost every day for him for nothing. And he was somehow in heaven. But he couldn't make ends meet, so he started to think about how to make money. And this is when the idea occurred to him that he could record his conversations with Goethe, because Goethe was such a celebrity, and that he could publish these conversations and thereby earn a handsome living. And this is how we know about this conversation and the birth of literature. And it's interesting to me that Ackermann here is the scribe. He is the one who records it, but also that he records it because he hopes to participate in a kind of book publishing market, which is actually a crucial component of how world literature emerges, and this is why I mention it here. So a strange story about this very impoverished, very provincial figure, Ackermann, who makes it to Goethe and records these conversations in order to make ends meet. So this is how this conversation gets written down. And we can say that, as I mentioned, this term world literature is, in a sense, it's a provocation or a challenge to Ackermann to think about literature much more broadly than he does. But it is, more importantly, in that quote you see here, it is a challenge to the idea of national literature. And that's the first definition of world literature, or the first context of world literature I want to offer here, the first challenge. And that was a really important one. Goethe in 1827 lived at the height of nationalism, especially in Germany, which was fragmented into small nation states and principalities like the one in Weimar where he lived. And so there was an extreme movement to create an idea of Germany based on culture and literature and culture. So search for fairy tales, the Brothers Grimm, all this is happening around Goethe. An important idea of a kind of cultural nationalism. But Goethe rejects this idea. Instead, he starts to read Chinese literature, not just Chinese literature, Arabic and Persian poetry, Sanskrit drama, everything he can get his hands on. And so it's really, in a sense, this is the first takeaway here, that this idea of world literature is a critique of nationalism. It's a kind of reaction against nationalism, and this is the first definition, especially for Goethe. So a critique of nationalism at the height of its heyday, in its heyday in the 19th century. But why in Weimar? Why is this idea of world literature invented in this relatively provincial, sort of semi-provincial location in Europe, in the small place Weimar, a city that at the time has about 7,000 inhabitants? Why wasn't the idea of world literature invented in Paris, say, the capital of the 19th century, or in London? My theory about this is that Goethe was not just faced with literary nationalism and reacted against it, as in that scene and in that quote about literature. There was a second moment or movement that he reacted against, namely the export, basically the French cultural export industry. Because here in the small town, a provincial town in Weimar, in the sort of semi-periphery of Europe, Goethe and everyone around it was really on the receiving end of French culture, especially in drama and theater. Goethe was among his many duties, was the director of a theater. German court culture really influenced by France, especially in the small provincial courts like Weimar. Goethe had, of course, grown up in the much more cosmopolitan Frankfurt, city of the book fair, among others. But then he had moved to Weimar, I think especially because, essentially because he wanted to be a big fish in a small pond. And he was really that. He started to take on more and more jobs at this provincial court. He not only ran the theater, he started to become Minister of War and building projects. He had his hands in more and more spheres of this very small duchy. But culturally on the receiving end of these metropolitan products. So for a time, he turns to England, especially famously Shakespeare, but also Samuel Richardson and others, as a kind of alternative to French culture. But ultimately, he doesn't stay with that. And this is as an alternative to that I think he starts to conceive of world literature. So from this first simple opposition, world literature against nationalism, I think we have to, and this is going to be my main theme, analytic method, basically a triangle between nationalism, world literature, and a kind of metropolitan export culture, primarily from France. And I think to understand world literature and its subsequent history, I'd say to this day, we have to understand it within that dynamic triangle between nationalism as a reaction both against nationalism and metropolitan exports. So world literature composed as a challenge to nationalism, but also as a challenge to metropolitanism. Okay, so we have maybe explained a little bit why the term world literature emerges from this strange, out of the way place in provincial Weimar, but what makes world literature possible? What makes it possible for Goethe to get his hands on something like a Chinese novel in this provincial place? One thing that makes it possible is translation, and Goethe is very conscious of it. Goethe never developed a theory of world literature. I'm trying to sort of piece together the contours of a theory or different ideas, components that go into this formulation of world literature in order to then extract it for our own purposes. So translation is an important part, and he knows it because Goethe doesn't read Chinese. He is very interested in languages. He studies many languages. He even, at an advanced age, he starts to take up Arabic because he's so interested in Arabic poetry. But he recognizes that something like world literature depends on translation. And the way he talks about it is very interesting. He says that whoever knows and studies German inhabits the marketplace where all nations offer their products. He plays the translator even as he reaps profits. So he doesn't think of Germany primarily as a producer of world literature, but as a kind of facilitator of world literature translation. And here I come to a first debate about world literature, a world literature that, a debate that in a way accuses world literature of relying too much on translation. And I think in a way it's descriptively true. World literature depends on translation, on the circulation of literature, and this is something that Goethe was aware of. And here I'm doing my first defense of world literature, what I object to is to see this as a problem. I think that in literary studies in general, we are too hung up on the original. I think we really fetishize the original, and I use this term almost in its original religious meaning. I think it has to do essentially with the status of scripture, of holy texts, and it's true historically that literary studies, literary hermeneutics emerges from the hermeneutics of religious texts. So I think there's a very problematic function, in the written world, I call it textual fundamentalism, that is at work here in literary studies and our insistence on the original. Now, to be sure, there are certain questions about literature, about a given text, that can only be answered with reference to the original, deep knowledge of the original and all of its valences. That's true. But I think there are also many, many, many excellent questions about literature that can be answered without reference to the original. And I think as literary studies, we are much too hung up on the original. And one reason why I emphasize this, not just because it's important for world literature, but because it's important for these kinds of larger scale projects and analyses that I'm going to be advocating later this week. So textual fundamentalism, a quasi-religious conception of the original, is one reason. I think also there's sort of vested interest in national literature departments where we like to erect barriers and not let people in. This is something, a critique that runs throughout the history of the term world literature. In the 20s, for example, a Chinese promoter of world literature, Cheng Du, writes, "We only see departments of English literature, French literature, German literature, Greek literature, but absolutely no department of literature that approaches as literature as a whole or independent subject." So I think there are various reasons for this oddly overcharged debate about translation, and I will come back to that a little more and in more detail also later next week. But my main defense here is that I think the accusation that world literature, that there's something problematic about the dependence on translation, I think is misguided for those two reasons. So I think part of what happens in the translation-based critique of world literature is that some of these critiques really aim at the metropolitan export culture of literature and mistake that for world literature. Translation, in a sense, is behind both metropolitan exports and world literature. And part of, I think, what happens in this critique, and I can talk about this in more detail tomorrow, it is a confusion between those two. But let's have one more look at Goethe's comment on translation, because you'll have noticed a very clear, in some sense, surprising language of marketplace, products, and profits. Surprising because Goethe in many ways is often seen as a kind of idealist, and he was. But here, in thinking about literature and world literature, he is quite materialistic, in a sense, about the fact that something like world literature is only possible because of a world market in literature. And that's the next perspective on world literature I want to offer, starting with a quote that I'm sure many of you will recognize. In exploiting the world market, the bourgeoisie has made production and consumption a cosmopolitan affair. Industry no longer uses local materials, but raw materials drawn from the remotest zones, and its products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have commerce in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. So a quote about an early phase of globalization and globalized industry that has in mind something like industrial Manchester. But so the text continues. As in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become increasingly impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. So strange to see literature mentioned in the same paragraph as industries, though one could say that in the 19th century is actually the first moment since Gutenberg when literature has become heavily industrialized and has become much more subject to mass production than it was before. As many of you will have recognized, this quote is from the Communist Manifesto, and it's very interesting. It's one of the most famous and one of my favorite paragraphs from the Communist Manifesto. In part, what's so interesting about it is that Marx and Engels here describe, they use the term bourgeoisie, it's their term for what we would call capitalism, a kind of global capitalism, first phase of global capitalism, as a kind of positive force that does away with national one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness. So at this moment in the argument, they're really in favor of capitalism, and not only in material, but also in intellectual production, and then surprisingly drop this relatively new term just a few decades after Goethe had coined it into the middle of the Communist Manifesto. So here we are back in a way in this relation, not just between world literature against nationalism, and somehow connected, but not the same as these metropolitan export products. So literary marketplace, I think, is an important keyword for us, and it plays some role in the scholarly debate about world literature. Scholars like Pascal Casanova have used the term of cultural capital to analyze world literature, and I think that's an important debate. But with Goethe and Marx and Engels, I would say that we actually also have to study actual capital, not just cultural capital, because that is part of what makes world literature, the world market in world literature possible. And because Tore Rem is in the audience here, I'll say as one great example of this is his wonderful book with Narve Fulsa, on Ibsen and world literature, where they tracked in great detail how Ibsen was basically able to launch his career in world literature through the way the Scandinavian marketplace centered in Copenhagen really functioned. And I think this is the kind of analysis that works really well with this market-based logic of world literature. My own little tidbit or addition here to this kind of market-based literature is something that I only learned a few years ago about how the contemporary marketplace in world literature works, and that has to do with literary scouts. A few years ago, if you had asked me, how does the contemporary marketplace in world literature works, I would have said, well, they're publishers, international publishers. Yes, they're great conglomerates. They're editors. There are agents. There are authors. But connecting all of these is this group of scouts who are very obscure and hard to even learn about. They don't appear in any acknowledgments. It's very hard to even find out who they are. And what they do is they trade in information about the publishing market. I have met some scouts who work especially in New York and who they basically learn about deals early in author book projects, and then they kind of try to sell them to the foreign markets. Really crucial mediators that basically make today's world market in literature work. And I've just, to show you the scope, a kind of list of mostly New York-based scouts that make the literary world go round. And I, for one, and it's interesting how they all have sort of their regional specialty and genre specialty and are really powerful and crucial. The list goes on. So a kind of market-based study of literature, I think, would include something like scouts. And I think we scholars need to develop a much more robust understanding of how this market works, both historically and today. Okay, so we have the market in world literature that Goethe sort of saw that he was sort of participating in. But we can ask, so where does this market in world literature come from? And here it might be good to zero in on one of these Chinese novels that Goethe read and that ultimately prompts him to coin this term, world literature. One of them is called Hao Qiu Chuan, or Pleasing History. It's a novel that was initially translated by James Wilkinson, a British subject and employee of the East India Company, who had been posted in Canton and who started to study Chinese, and as a kind of language exercise starts to translate this novel really badly with lots of crossings out and attempts. It was really a language exercise. But then before he's finished, he gets posted elsewhere and he abandons this manuscript. And there it lingers until it falls into the hands of Bishop Thomas Percy, who goes over the manuscript, corrects many of what he perceives as mistakes, and finally publishes it in 1761. The result, though, was still far from perfect. 70 years later, John Francis Davis, the second governor of Hong Kong, and the son of one of the heads of the East India Company, sees this book, undertakes a second translation, is scathing in his critique of the first translators, who, he says, managed to even mistranslate the very title of the book. For Goethe, unfortunately, this translation is too late. He actually read the terrible translation done by these agents of the East India Company, which is interesting, which brings us back to this question of translation, that even this really, really terrible translation was able to have such lasting effect on Goethe, prompting him ultimately to coin this term and thereby change in a small way literary history. So the important point, though, is that these translators were employees of the East India Company, and this raises another contentious debate about world literature, and one that's to my mind, more substantial and more important than the one about translation, and namely that's the relation between world literature and colonialism. And the basic question is, to what extent is this term world literature dependent on, tainted by colonialism, or even an instrument of European colonialism? Are any of these true, and can we or should we extract or rescue this term from this origin? It's a really complicated and really important debate. And here, maybe we come to the kind of European part of these lectures. I have to admit that I struggled a little bit how to do justice to this European dimension of these lectures. Of course, I am European. I grew up in Europe, even though I've spent more than half my year in the States. I care about Europe, and I'm talking here about a European idea, essentially. World literature is a European idea, though it then leaves Europe and is taken up in other ways I will sketch in a second. So my answer to this question is that clearly Goethe, and thereby the notion of world literature, is a beneficiary of European colonialism. Otherwise, these texts would not have been translated, and Marx and Engels would agree. This is how this world market in literature emerges. Goethe himself, however, was not at all involved in colonialism, simply because Germany didn't have colonies, especially the small provincial duchy of Weimar did not. But he was a beneficiary, I would say, of colonialism. At the same time, what he tries to do with this term world literature is, I think, create a counter canon, to critique European, a kind of purely European world of literature. This is what maybe Ackermann represents in this term, as well as this metropolitan idea, sort of export idea. So, this is what he experiences when he is in his beautiful library, Anna Amalia library, over which he presides and where he finds all these works. He knows that they are sort of brought to him by colonialism, but I don't necessarily think that that idea of European colonialism is baked into the idea of world literature, or that even if it were, I think it still might be possible to extract it from that origin and use it for our own purposes. This is at least my hunch. So another way of formulating this is that to say that world literature is less important than asking what is world literature and therefore whether it's colonialist, is to ask who uses the term world literature and for what purposes. And as I said, my hypothesis is that it has to do with this triangulation here, and that colonialism is not primarily or not only as part of world literature, but primarily part of the metropolitan idea. I want to just support this briefly by looking a little bit on who used the term world literature and for what purpose. The first figure I want to briefly mention is Rabindranath Tagore, who is, I think, a fascinating figure. He's long been neglected by scholars, especially of modernism, because he didn't fit the paradigm of modernism. And I think there's sort of right now a kind of mini revival of Tagore that I think is very salutary. He, I think, fits my triangle extremely well, because on the one hand, he's of course very interested in promoting the great Indian epics, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, but he doesn't promote them, interestingly, writing under the conditions of colonialism, by reverting to nationalism. Nationalism was Tagore's big enemy. He criticized nationalism everywhere. So at the same time, of course, he was anti-colonialism in a basic form. It is in that triangle that he starts to lecture on world literature in a lecture on 1907. He's supposed to talk about comparative literature, but he says, no, I do not like this term comparative literature. I would prefer to use the term world literature, and he then translates it into Bengali. So I think this is, in a way, a typical moment in the history of world literature. And as I said, I think we're sort of at the cusp of a kind of revival of Tagore. I'll mention one scholar who I worked with a little bit at Harvard, who has a wonderful chapter in her new book about Tagore. I think he's a good example of my triangle, this triangle between nationalism and colonialism or metropolitan exports fits that paradigm really well. My next example or other example is a very different figure, namely the Yiddish writer Manik Ravitch. We are now sort of in the first half of the 20th century, and promoters of Yiddish literature have basically kind of waging a two-front war. On the one hand, they have to wage a war against Zionism, because Zionism implies, and is clear, and this is of course what then happens in history, a return to Hebrew. So this is sort of one front. The other front is assimilation. Assimilation, the use of German or other European languages. And so it's very complicated for promoters of Yiddish to navigate this terrain. But it is in this situation that Manik Ravitch uses this term, Weltliteratur. And to promote this, of course, global Yiddish phenomenon that's produced in many continents, it's a minor literature, and he uses the term in part for Yiddish literature to gain a place at the table, so to speak. World literature would mean a certain recognition that Yiddish is one of the world literatures, but I think, again, fits my triangle really well, because again, we have someone who is who's trying to mediate between, on the one hand, nationalism, in this case, Hebrew literature, Zionism, on the other, assimilation into German, which is sort of, in this context, my translation of metropolitan exports in this context. So we have two very different, very interesting figures who I think are able, despite the complicated history of world literature, despite, or maybe because of its strange provincial origins in the semi-periphery, to use this term for their different purposes, to translate it both into Yiddish and into Bengali. So I think this, in a way, to my mind, confirms my hunch that it's not so. I think the debate about sort of pro-contra world literature is a little bit hung up at this moment into what is world literature, and is it universalist or is it colonialist? And I think that that debate has reached a little bit of a dead end. And so my strategy is to ask, as I have, not so much what is world literature, I think there is no single criterion, but to ask who uses world literature for what purposes. And this is sort of my argument here, and I think a lot of those uses and purposes have to do with this triangle. I want to wrap up just by briefly sketching another dimension of this method, asking not what is world literature, but who uses it for what purposes, because it's not just individuals who use this term world literature, but also, and very importantly, institutions. And I think that right now is sort of the most exciting frontier of research in world literature. What kinds of institutions, in other words, rely on the term world literature, of course, but then generate canons of world literature, and for what purpose? So I just want to mention, just really quickly in passing, a couple of them. One, a grad student of mine who just finished his dissertation found that the Olympic Games, for the first 50 years of their existence, ran arts competitions. You could win a gold medal in 5 arts subjects. Really fascinating. Almost no, I didn't know this. Everyone I talk about it very excitedly says, I had no idea this happened, especially at the Paris 1924 Olympics. Edith Wharton was one of the judges. Really fascinating story that I think shows precisely, of course, the Olympic Games, perfect example of this kind of national internationalism that's very important for world literature. So that's one place where this idea emerges. Another current dissertation student is checking how US service academies are the academies of the armed forces. So the Naval Academy, West Point, and the Air Force Academy in Colorado use canons of world literature for their officers' training. Also think tanks like Davos and the Aspen Institute. The Aspen Institute was actually founded with a celebration of Goethe's birthday. So really interesting uses made of literature and world literature. Not always uses that we might necessarily condone, but uses, and that's part of where these canons of world literature are put together. And then a young dissertation student in Berlin who's looking at UNESCO and the way they try to create, through their translation programs, canons of world literature. So this too is something that I want to elaborate a little bit later this week when I talk more in more detail about another institution where the term world literature is deployed and a canon of world literature is created, namely world literature and anthologies. So this is basically my view then of world literature. It arises out of a particular context that I think poses very salutary challenges to our disciplinary conceptions, challenges having to do with an emphasis on translation, a pretty sort of hard-nosed analysis of the literary marketplace, and institutions, and an analysis that would emphasize institutions where particular canons of world literature are created. So I think we can extract a lot from this moment of origin and from its subsequent history, and I think we should, because I think there's a lot we can do with the term world literature. And this is what I want to elaborate next for the next two lectures, both on Thursday or Friday, talking about large scales, maybe both, talking about large scales and what that kind of perspective enables us to see. And then on the last day, a really instrumentalist view of literature in relation to climate change. Thank you very much.
So I can see two hands up, and a mic is coming. It's a rather exotic mic in the shape of a cube. So caress it and give us wonderful questions.
No, it's thank you very much. Well, first of all, I think that Goethe would have been very happy with this conception. So the first, I think, answer I would say is that yes, but I think what Goethe is concerned with, and maybe I, or people who advocate this term world literature now, is the impediments perhaps for seeing that, or not just acknowledging it, but actually let that infiltrate how we do literary studies, how we do analysis, what kind of scope, how we define our object of study. And because I think the way our literary system is configured right now is not conducive to actually building. If you were to start fresh, so to speak, and built a profession around the insight you articulated, I don't think you would come up with our current configuration. I think it's very interesting, since Philip, you mentioned that you're all thinking about, in a way, maybe with the Humanities Center, how to think about comparative literature, how to think about how to configure that. So I think there are actually non-trivial implications about what you present as a kind of common sense view, which I would heartily agree with, that have to do with how the profession and how our optics are organized. Because there are lots of questions, as you say, that stem from it, that some of them, and I should say I'm not so much interested here in defending Goethe, but I think there's a lot of interest here, but he starts in this conversation, he starts to speculate, how come I'm able to read that novel? Which I know very little about, although he then starts to take out the few books on sinology that he finds in his beautiful library to try to get some cultural context. So how much cultural context do you need? What you have to know about narrative types, what you have to know about the culture. I mean, there are all kinds of questions about this kind of distant reading, if you will, that I agree come from this idea that their stories are everywhere, writing systems are everywhere, but there are also lots of differences in how do they circulate and how do we navigate it and how do we deal with translations. I think all of these would be actually at the center of a study of world literature as I see it. And they're not questions that are completely neglected either, but as I said, I think that there are actually non-trivial consequences to it. But I'm really glad that you find the basic idea so clear as to be trivial, and that I think there are worse things. Let's be trivial.
Slightly Wildian sentiment, perhaps. Sort of the delight of triviality. I can see Ben and one in front, yeah?
No, great, thank you very much. So I think I'll talk about this a lot in my third day, but just to kind of anticipate a little bit, totally agree about climate, about psychological research and why stories are more effective. I'll mention that briefly. But so I think there are various ways in which we can talk about. We can do it in a kind of narratological way, and I think this is one way in which, this one way of describing Goethe's this other moment where he talks about it. So what kinds of stories are available, how we can get off the kind of hang up on apocalyptic stories, where do these come from, and so on and so forth. There's beginning to be some work in literary studies about that. I think for me equally important is looking in the history of world literature for collective protagonists. I think there is a lot, even in the media right now, Greta Thunberg, right? Do we need a new hero of climate change? Or how can we think of collective protagonists? I'll actually be going back to the Communist Manifesto, because that is one place where a text tries to bring into being a collective protagonist, namely the proletariat that hadn't really existed before. There's a formal question. I'm part of an initiative called Stories for the Future, working with a science think tank, where we're trying to figure out how to basically collect and use stories and create anthologies of world literature that rethink the history of literature, beginning with the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first use of the flood, the first text that talks about resource extraction, to the present. So there are lots of ways of going towards that. But I think in some sense in my story, the human element is crucial, because for me, it's about human action. There is, of course, you're absolutely right, a whole nother way of, and this is what eco-criticism has, I think, more or less exclusively emphasized, namely, right, how can we make this slow-moving crisis, how can we bring it into visibility, how we can turn nature into a kind of protagonist, how can we represent trees as the oldest living organism. I think these are all great also great questions for literary critics to do. And because there's clearly one big problem with climate change is one of representation, visibility, and so on and so forth. So I totally agree about that. There's a lot of work in eco-criticism about animal studies and extending protagonists and consciousness to other life forms. But for me, I think you're absolutely right. My emphasis, because this need of climate scientists to create human change is key towards human readers and actors. And so this is what I'm emphasizing.
So we had a question on the fourth row here, Justine.
No, fair question. So, and it echoes some remarks of the previous, the human element, the dramatic storytelling I'm doing. I too like to, well, let me put it this way. It's true that I start with this dramatic exchange. I think not just because it is dramatic, I think because it allows me a first step into this triangle. This is really my analytical tool, is this triangle. And I think the exchange is sort of an exchange between two sides of this triangle, nationalism versus world literature. So I think it's not just a storytelling vehicle, a convenient or interesting or vivid one. I think it's one that opens up a substantial dimension of this dynamic, namely the first part of the triangle. That would be my my defense of the use of this scene. The point about rhetoric is interesting, and it perhaps goes to this question of the literary in the story. And there's of course a long, and it's a long, complicated debate, what is literature? Our notion is a kind of post-romantic notion of a certain writing of a certain level that's imaginative, that is the emerging oppositions between fact and fiction, for example. I promote, especially in the context of world literature, not the history of the term, which I talked about today, but of the story of written stories that's 4,000 years long, a much more expansive notion of literature that absolutely includes some of the subjects you mentioned, rhetoric, that looks at storytelling in what we would retrospectively classify as religious texts or political texts. That's why I'm very interested in texts like the Declaration of Independence or the Communist Manifesto, also religious texts. So for me, storytelling, and I'll mention, and you'll see in the next two lectures, is much wider. And so I'm not very invested in this kind of art notion of literature that I think that's been very important in the last 200 years. And I would say Goethe's notion of literature is also much more expansive than that. So I'm not sure I've really answered your question about, Goethe doesn't come out of nowhere. That's absolutely true. There are lots of figures that are important for this story, but I think for me, what brings me back to Goethe is that even though he has very limited information, he has just a few reading experiences that he really glimpses the contours of this world literature marketplace and this circulation of literature that really comes into its own only about 50, 60 years later, and I think that's still with us today. So for me, he's really a way into explaining what is happening right now much more effectively than someone like Herder, I suppose. So that, no.
I collected, I think, 2 more questions here on the front, yeah? So I don't know which order you want to take them, because I'm not going to arbitrate as to which hand was first.
Absolutely, I think I would totally agree with that. And the question of these different comparativisms, as you call them, and nationalism, it's a really complicated story, right? I mean, Max Müller here is a good example. And so it seems on the one hand, they are really broadening the horizon of European thought, these figures, and I think they genuinely do. But they also transport a lot of European and Eurocentric ideas, Aryan philology and what have you, and that's also true of Goethe. There's no doubt about it. So the way, oops.
I think that might be the cosmos.
I see. So, well, I'll try to talk very quietly. Can you still hear me? So I think the way I would answer that is that I'm sure, oversimplified by saying that world literature is a simple rejection of nationalism. I think the more complicated and probably truer one, and echoing what various people have said, is that nationalism and world literature are sort of entangled. And the same is true of the other axis of the triangle, cosmopolitan, metropolitan export product. So there, you could also say that, the more extreme version is to say that world literature depends on nationalism. It would be impossible with it's sort of a reaction or even a internal critique, perhaps even of it. So I think I totally agree. It's a very complicated a dynamic. But I would say, and that's maybe the astonishing part, or maybe not, that Goethe glimpses as other people are good examples of this in the early 19th century, and I think it's very much still true today. And I mean, the way nationalism has roared back into life, I mean, it's just one way of talking about it. So you're absolutely right. It's not enough to say world literature is anti-nationalist. Thank you very much. Goodbye. It's a complicated entanglement.
It's not quite time for thank you and goodbye, but I think I've seen 3 hands, and if we can collect those questions, perhaps that might be help and expedient. So I've got 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so I'll keep an eye on this side, Justine. So can we get yours first? And then we'll take yours, and then we'll let Martin respond collectively or singularly. Quickly.
Okay, I think it's a great question. I mean, since you mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh, Saddam Hussein wrote a contemporary adaptation of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So, I mean, there are many uses made out of. I mean, in general, I'm almost always for the circulation and the adaptation and the use of literature. I'm sure there are some limits to it. So I think there is no one answer to your question. What, is it good? What happens? It really depends. But I would also always ask whether all of these adaptations are really national adaptations. I mean, they're local adaptations, maybe going back to the first question. So who is, again, I would ask, who is making use of these texts and myths and for what purpose? And sometimes it might be national purposes, definitely, but maybe sometimes not. But the very act of using, someone else's myth and nationalizing it itself is perhaps a perfect example of this entanglement rather than simple opposition between world literature and national literature that I just mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
So thank you very much. No, I mean, it's a crucial question. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this collaboration with this research institute where one of my former students, this is a collaboration with her, whose background is as a dancer, has started to work with scientists and basically is turning scientific papers into sometimes games, sometimes dance performances, sometimes stories. So the purpose there is not so much to fault scientists for writing in a scientific style. The question is more to recognize, well, that has a particular purpose, maybe an internal discussion, and that's really important. But it's clearly not enough. And how can we translate that into other forms of storytelling? And so I think she, for example, has done some really great work. She collaborated with Martin Nowak, a really prominent evolutionary biologist at Harvard, who tells a very different story. Of course, scientists themselves also tell grand stories, like the story of evolution, who emphasizes not the survival of the fittest, the sort of egotistic version of Darwinism, but the importance in evolution of cooperation, different forms of cooperation. And so that's one of the papers that she turned into forms of public storytelling, in this case through dance and game. So yes, that is in a way exactly where I'm hoping to land next week. Thank you.
And then I think we take one last question.
Right, if I can ask this question, to me.
Oh yeah, there. It's a very easy answer. Just kidding. No, but absolutely. I think there's a great, and I would say my own entry, as this is mostly next week, day after tomorrow's lecture, is about, in fact, anthologies. It's one of the institutions of world literature, which is a perfect example of curation and how we can use that as a world literature tool for all kinds of particular purposes. So I think that's a very helpful distinction here between creation and curation. And I think world literature entails both, but there's in some sense even more an emphasis on the latter. Curation is a great term. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, the number and content of those questions only attests to the excitement of the material we just had and the quality of the storytelling that took us there. We can continue over a glass of wine, but first I'd like to thank Martin for that terrific first lecture.